The news spread like wildfire across the quiet coastal town, a story so extraordinary it felt like something from a movie rather than real life. A single father, a man who spent his nights mopping floors and emptying trash cans at the local high school, had done something that even trained professionals might hesitate to attempt. His name was Ethan Cole, and until yesterday, he was just another face in the crowd, a janitor working quietly to make ends meet and raise his 10-year-old daughter, Lily. But everything changed when a Navy fighter jet went down in the icy waters off the Virginia coastline. The crash happened just after dusk, when most of the town's residents were settling in for dinner or watching the evening news. People later said they heard a distant boom followed by the unmistakable roar of an engine sputtering out. A few moments later came a second sound, the deafening splash of metal hitting water. Those who lived close to the beach rushed outside, and among them was Ethan, who had just finished his shift at the school. He'd been pushing his old pickup down the road toward home when he saw smoke rising from the water, an orange glow cutting through the fog. His instincts took over before his mind had time to process the danger. He stopped the truck, jumped out, and ran toward the shoreline, his work boots sinking into the wet sand. The air smelled of fuel and salt, thick and sharp enough to sting his nose. Somewhere in the darkness, he could hear faint cries, short, broken shouts that told him someone was alive out there. There was no one else in sight, no Coast Guard yet, no emergency lights flickering in the distance. For a moment, the world was just wind, water, and one man sprinting toward disaster. Ethan tore off his jacket, grabbed a length of rope from the back of his truck, and without thinking twice, plunged into the frigid Atlantic. The cold hit him like a wall. Every muscle in his body screamed, but he kept swimming, his eyes locked on the faint silhouette of the sinking jet. Each stroke felt heavier as the waves crashed against him, but the cries grew louder, closer. When he reached the wreckage, he saw the pilot, half submerged, his helmet cracked, struggling to open the cockpit latch. The jet was listing dangerously, the tail already vanishing beneath the waves. Ethan shouted, "Hold on," though his own voice was nearly swallowed by the wind. The pilot tried to respond, but his strength was fading fast. Using the rope, Ethan tied it around a protruding part of the fuselage to steady himself, then reached for the latch. It was jammed. He gritted his teeth and pulled with everything he had. His hands slipped once, twice, but on the third try, it gave way with a sharp metallic snap. Water surged in as the cockpit flooded. Ethan reached inside, grabbed the pilot by his harness, and pulled him free, both of them tumbling backward into the freezing current. The jet sank seconds later, disappearing beneath a swirl of bubbles and oil. Ethan wrapped the rope around the pilot's chest and began towing him back toward shore. The man was barely conscious, his lips blue, his breathing shallow. Ethan's lungs burned, his arms screamed in pain, but the thought of Lily flashed through his mind, how she always looked for him in the bleachers after her soccer games, how she told him he was her hero even when all he did was pack her lunch and work nights. He couldn't let her see a headline tomorrow about a man who didn't make it home. So he swam harder. By the time his feet touched sand, Ethan could hardly stand. He dragged the pilot up the shore, collapsed beside him, and began pressing on his chest. The pilot coughed, sputtered, and finally gasped for air. For a long moment, the two men just lay there, side by side, breathing in ragged bursts while the tide crept around them. Then Ethan whispered, "You're gonna be okay," before rolling onto his back and staring at the stars that flickered through the smoke-filled sky. By the time emergency crews arrived, the jet was gone, swallowed whole by the ocean. The rescue team found Ethan and the pilot clinging to consciousness on the beach. Witnesses said they saw him refuse medical attention until he was sure the Navy officer was safe. When they asked his name, he simply said, "Ethan Cole. I just did what anyone would have done." But not everyone agreed. The Coast Guard captain who arrived later called it one of the bravest acts he'd ever seen. The temperature that night had dropped below 40 degrees, and the current was strong enough to pull even a trained swimmer under. The Navy confirmed that the pilot, Lieutenant Commander James Rourke, would not have survived another 5 minutes in the cockpit. Without Ethan's intervention, the man would have drowned in the wreckage. Word spread quickly through the town. People who knew Ethan described him as quiet, humble, and endlessly hard-working, a man who never complained, even when life had been hard on him. He had lost his wife years earlier and had been raising Lily on his own ever since. His co-workers said he often stayed late at the school, fixing things nobody else bothered with. To them, it wasn't surprising that he'd risk his life for someone else. It was just who he was. That night, though, after the chaos had settled and the beach was cleared, Ethan went home to his small, cluttered house on the edge of town. He didn't think about the headlines or the praise that might come. He just thought about the sound of the pilot gasping for air and the weight of that rope in his hands. He thought about how close death had come, for both of them. In the quiet of his home, Lily hugged him tightly, tears wetting his shoulder as she asked if he was hurt. He smiled weakly and told her he was fine, though his hands still trembled. Outside, the waves continued to crash against the shore, carrying away the last pieces of wreckage. Inside, Ethan Cole, a man who had spent most of his life unnoticed, sat beside his daughter, unaware that the world was about to notice him in a way he never imagined. The story of the janitor who saved a Navy officer began as a whisper in a small town, but by morning it would become national news. No one yet knew that this act of courage would not only change the life of one man but would shake the walls of the very institution whose uniform he had saved. Because while Ethan slept that night, exhausted and unaware, 5 military Humvees were already on their way toward his home. The Navy wasn't coming just to thank him, they were coming to make sure the man who had saved one of their own would never again be overlooked. The night after the rescue was quiet, but inside Ethan Cole's modest home, silence carried a strange weight. His body ached from exhaustion, every muscle sore from the struggle in the ocean. The smell of salt and fuel still clung to his clothes no matter how many times he washed his hands. He sat by the window, staring at the dark horizon beyond the rooftops, half expecting to hear the roar of engines or the crash of waves again. The events of the evening played in his mind over and over, the desperate cries, the freezing water, the moment when he thought they both might not make it back. Across the room, his daughter Lily slept soundly on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her small hand clutching the sleeve of his damp jacket. For her, it was just another night. For Ethan, it was the night everything changed. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pilot's face underwater, the fear in his eyes, the final gasp before he pulled him free. He wondered if the man was still alive, if the rescue crews had managed to stabilize him. Ethan didn't know his name, his rank, or even what mission he'd been flying. All he knew was that he was human and needed help, and that had been enough. When dawn began to break, the quiet town started to stir. Newspapers hadn't yet carried the story, but the whispers had begun. Locals who lived near the coast had seen the flashing emergency lights during the night and the Coast Guard trucks that came and went. By morning, small rumors floated around the diner, the gas station, the school bus stop. Someone said a Navy jet had gone down. Another claimed a man had jumped into the ocean to save the pilot. Few knew it was Ethan Cole, the janitor they greeted every morning at the school, the man who fixed their leaky pipes or swept their gym floors. By 7, the phone in his small kitchen began to ring. First it was his supervisor at the school, who had heard something from the police. Then it was a local reporter asking for a comment. Ethan didn't pick up. He wasn't looking for attention, didn't even want to talk about it. He just wanted to make sure the man he'd saved was still breathing. He went to check the morning news online but found nothing yet. For a moment, he wondered if maybe the Navy would try to keep the story quiet. Military accidents were often surrounded by silence and protocol. But that changed within the hour. The first report came through the local radio station. Breaking news: a U.S. Navy pilot survived a jet crash off the Virginia coast last night thanks to the heroic actions of a local resident. The announcer didn't mention a name yet, but Ethan felt his heart tighten. It was only a matter of time. Within minutes, a news van appeared at the end of his street. Then another. He stepped outside, bleary-eyed, wearing an old sweatshirt and jeans, as reporters hurried toward him. Flashing cameras, hurried voices, and questions all at once. "Sir, can you confirm you rescued the Navy pilot? What were you thinking when you went into the water? Do you consider yourself a hero?" Ethan didn't know what to say. He muttered something about just doing what anyone would have done and slipped back inside. The attention made him uncomfortable. He wasn't trained for this kind of spotlight. He wasn't someone who knew how to handle microphones and headlines. He was a janitor, a father, a man trying to keep his small life steady. At the same time, on a nearby naval base, Lieutenant Commander James Rourke was awake in a hospital bed, wrapped in bandages, his lungs raw from inhaling salt water. His first request when he regained consciousness was simple: he wanted to know who had saved him. When they told him it wasn't a rescuer or a fellow officer but a civilian, a janitor, he refused to believe it. Then he remembered the face in the water, the strength of the hands pulling him free, and tears filled his eyes. He asked to speak to his commanding officer immediately. The Navy began to trace the identity of the man who had been on the shore. Within hours, Ethan Cole's name appeared on their report. The commanding admiral made a call personally. The story had already begun circulating internally across military channels. An untrained civilian had risked his life in freezing water to save a Navy officer, something even experienced rescuers might hesitate to do. There was no protocol for how to thank a man like that, but the Navy wasn't about to let it pass quietly. By the time the sun had risen fully, the rumble of engines broke the peace of the small neighborhood. Ethan stood at his kitchen sink when he heard it, deep, steady, mechanical. He looked out the window and froze. 5 dark green Humvees rolled slowly down the narrow street, their tires crunching on gravel. One after another, they pulled up in front of his small, aging house. Neighbors began to step out onto their porches, coffee mugs in hand, whispering to each other. The American flags in front yards fluttered in the morning breeze as uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicles. Lily ran to the window and gasped. "Daddy, are they here for you?" He didn't know what to say. For a moment, his heart pounded in his chest with confusion and disbelief. The lead Humvee door opened, and out stepped a man in full Navy dress uniform, an admiral, his medals gleaming in the sunlight. He was followed by several officers and 2 enlisted sailors carrying a carefully folded American flag. The sight felt surreal, as if the entire world had suddenly turned its eyes on one man who had spent his life trying not to be noticed. The admiral walked toward the front door as reporters from earlier rushed to capture the scene from a distance. No one dared interrupt as the officers lined up on the small patch of lawn in front of Ethan's home. The neighborhood, usually filled with the sound of children's bicycles and barking dogs, fell completely silent. It was the kind of silence that came only when something extraordinary was unfolding. Ethan opened the door slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know how to stand, what to say, or even how to breathe in that moment. He wasn't used to respect or ceremony. For years he had worked quietly in the background, invisible to most, sweeping up after others, fixing what they broke, earning just enough to survive. And now here he was, face to face with some of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy, all because he couldn't watch another man die. The admiral removed his cap, stepped forward, and extended his hand. There were no formal words at first, no speeches, just a quiet acknowledgement between 2 men who understood the weight of what had happened. Then, in a low, steady voice, the admiral said, "Mr. Cole, you saved one of ours. The Navy doesn't forget something like that." Those words echoed in Ethan's mind long after the handshake ended. Around them, neighbors began to applaud softly, hesitant at first, then louder, until the sound filled the street. Lily stood beside her father, her eyes wide with pride and confusion. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew one thing: her dad, the man who spent his nights cleaning classrooms, had done something that made the world stop and take notice. That morning would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, though Ethan didn't yet know it. For now, he only felt a mix of disbelief and humility, as if fate had chosen him for a moment he never expected. The Humvees outside his small house were more than a symbol of gratitude. They were a reminder that courage could come from anywhere, even from a man with calloused hands and a janitor's badge in his pocket.